All right, so you should be in Psalm 37. Let me summarize last week. Ephesians 6:15, we talked about the sandals of readiness. And that's where Paul talks about making sure that we shod our feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And I deviated from the typical teaching, which is normally about how this is being willing to go out and share the gospel, because I believe that Paul's core message is not about us evangelizing, but it's about how God equips us as soldiers to fight our spiritual battles. And he kind of frames that in the very beginning where he introduces it and says that, he says, put on your armor, put on the armor of God, the full armor of God, so that you can stand against the wiles of the devil. And that's, certainly not the context of evangelism, and that's not to downplay the importance of that, but just to try to remember that context is pretty much everything when it comes to interpretation and trying to understand what somebody is saying. So this whole idea of the preparation of peace, I said it was a message of encouragement for when your heart begins to fail you and you lose courage, which is very easy to do when you're up against an enemy who knows your weak points and is patient enough to wait until you're tired or when you're distracted, right? And that's part of the whole methodia, the cunning craftiness, the strategic planning that our enemy goes to, right? He uses deceit and doubt to trick our mind, and he uses discouragement to stall our heart. And so when you're battle weary, what solid ground do we want to make sure that our feet are on? And it's the gospel of peace and how that should sustain our fight. And last week I focused on three things. I focused on the imagery of the caligae, the Roman soldiers' footwear, right? That heavy leather sandal that allowed them to force march 20, 30 miles a day, wearing 50 pounds of armor and gear to navigate tricky terrain. And we said that was probably a metaphor for the Christian journey and how it's long and it's slow, but it's also full of obstacles that we can trip over. Then we focused on the word readiness or preparation and how it's all about being effectively prepared to meet a challenge. And I use the word fitness, not in fitness in strength and cardiovascular capacity, but fitness meaning suited to do something specific, like fitness for battle. And how all of that led into preparation, which stems from the gospel of peace itself, right? And I pointed out that Paul didn't cite the all-encompassing gospel of the kingdom. He didn't focus on a specific subset of the gospel of Christ and the work that he did on the cross. He said that our feet are to be planted on the solid ground, right? We link our preparation and our solid footing as a warrior in battle to the promise and the hope of peace, which is what everyone who's going through a fight wants. They want it to stop, and eventually it will stop, right? So as Paul said, and this is with my own little twist, I can fight all battles through Christ, who trains, equips, and strengthens me. And the God of peace himself is always with me, and he's promised me peace is coming. Just hang in there and stay on your feet, right? That was the message that I hope we took away from last week. So you should be in Psalm 37. In verse 1, we're just going to read, 5, 6, 7 verses. So verse 1, do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. He shall bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Now, David here gives us a great list. Do not fret, trust, delight, commit, rest, and wait patiently. Right? So when you get a chance, go through those first 7 verses and highlight or circle the actions that David is asking us to take, right? So in verse 1, it's do not fret. Verse 3, it's trust. Verse 4, delight. 5 is commit. 7 is rest, and wait patiently, right? And that's a great list for us to just kind of dwell on and meditate on and pray about. Skip down to verse 34. He says, "Wait on the Lord and keep his way, and he shall exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you shall see it." And he's talking about, when it says when the wicked are cut off, you shall see it, it's talking about the return of Christ and the end of days. And this whole train of thought leads me right into our next lesson, which is about the shield of faith. And you can, if you want, you can flip to Ephesians 6:16, but we're actually going to be going to Romans 8 very quickly. But let me just read Ephesians 6:16, which is the next aspect of the armor of God. Paul says, "Above all, taking the shield of faith with which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one." And we're going to come back to that in a second. But first, I want to make a connection between faith and waiting. And I want to start out by asking a question, which is not rhetorical. I'd like some discussion on some of these things. Why do we wait for anyone or anything? Why do we wait?
We have an expectation of the end result.
Yeah, that's very simple. I mean, waiting implies that we expect something to happen, right? We just some simple things like we wait for a bus because we expect it to show up on time and take us somewhere. We wait for a plane to land or a car to pull into the driveway so we can see our loved ones. Or we wait for the phone call that says, "Hey, you got the job," or "You got into college," or whatever it is. And those are all positive expectations. But expectations can also fall on the negative side, can't they? Right? So unfortunately right now we have some negative expectations as it relates to Toby, our dog. Right? So we wait for our sick and aged loved ones to go to their rest, or in the economy as it has been in the past, we wait for the boss to say that they're downsizing and we're next on the list, or maybe you didn't get into college, or whatever the case is. There's so many different examples, but life is a continuous flow of everything that hasn't happened yet. And because the future holds so many different possibilities and choices, we spend a lot of time waiting with both positive and negative expectations. In other words, life is characterized by some kind of balance or maybe alternating states of hope and fear, with hope being the positive expectation, fear being a negative expectation. And I think one of the tricks of being happy and content is to make sure that you control that balance. Now, some people are naturally born optimists, some are naturally born pessimists, so they tend to fall more on one side of that balance compared to the other one. But I believe that you can become what you aren't with practice and intent, right? So if you are a natural pessimist who tends to see the negative side of things and you tend to expect the worst, you can train yourself to not be that way. It might not come naturally, it might be a long process, but it doesn't mean that you can't turn yourself into an optimist when you're a pessimist, and start to live in the hope, live in the positive expectation of the future. Go to Romans chapter 8. Paul told Timothy, we're not going there, but in 2 Timothy, Paul said to Timothy that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So Paul contrasts fear with power, love, and a sound mind. And I was looking at that today, and it was making me think that, I wonder what it is that people fear the most, and is that what Paul is talking about? And I can imagine, and I didn't take the time to go out and study this because I'm sure it has been studied, but I would imagine that when Paul says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but power, love, and a sound mind, it's probably because it's not uncommon for people to fear being helpless. And what is the opposite of being helpless? It's being powerful. He also probably says that God has given a spirit of love because we fear being rejected and unloved. We are, by nature, creatures of community. We crave fellowship. We crave being with other people. And his phrase, sound mind, it's kind of interesting because it's a difficult word to translate because It's hardly ever used in the Bible, in the New Testament or even the Greek version of the Old Testament. But in essence, when he says of a sound mind, he's not talking about God wants us to not be crazy or insane, but it's more about being able to discern and understand and to be able to exercise self-discipline. Right? So Paul, again, if you want to write it down, is 2 Timothy 1:7 says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Let's use the word wisdom, just kind of plug that in there. And with that in mind, look at Romans 8:12. He says, therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs of Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The sufferings of this present time kind of sounds like the battle, right? So aside from the specific details of being adopted as children of God, what is Paul saying here to the Romans? I'll give you a second. Yeah, go ahead.
The suffering they were going through in persecution and all in this present time isn't worthy to be compared with our future eternal life in the kingdom of God and all the wonderful things God has prepared for us.
But why is that? I mean, why? What's the point that Paul is trying to make? Like, and I understand that's certainly the immediate understanding interpretation is that the struggle is not comparable to the reward at the end of the struggle.
The struggle is temporary. The reward is eternal.
Right? I don't disagree at all. There's one more thing that I'm looking for.
Wasn't Christ able to go through what he went through because he was looking forward to what was before him?
Yeah, so in yes, what allowed Christ to go through it? I mean, yes, he knew what was on the other side, but what allowed him as a total human being, as frail as we are, what allowed him to endure all of that? It's not just the promise of what was ahead.
He said it was the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross.
Mm-hmm. But why did he believe it?
Well, he believed his father's words, the scriptures that foretold what was going to happen in the future. He had the trust in God. God had the power to resurrect him, and then he someday would be ruler over the whole earth, and he'd have his inheritance. He believed that.
Right. You said one word that was what I was looking for. He trusted. He had the confidence that what his father said was going to happen, and Paul is essentially doing the same thing here. That the struggle that we're in, compared to the result at the end, we have to trust that result is going to happen, or else the message loses its motivational force. Right? We can be confident that through obedience and through our relationship with God, that we can endure the fight. Because if we didn't have confidence that he would give us his strength and there would be a reward far greater than the battle, why would we even struggle if we weren't confident and we didn't trust and if we didn't have faith in him? Right? So yes, the struggles of this present time are minuscule and inconsequential. So Paul is saying, trusting that the future will be a future of rest and peace, you can be confident that it will be worth it to push through, no matter how hard the battle is, right? So Paul is saying that. He's saying the surface things that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy. But underneath that, there is the assumption that God is trustworthy, that he's made this promise and it's going to happen, right? He's also saying you have to fight and wait, fight and wait, fight and wait, because even for us, the promise is far off, nearer than it's ever been, but it's still far off. And how far off was it for the Romans that he was talking to, maybe somewhere around 65 AD or so? Right? So we can rest assured, or we can be assured, that the promises of God are certain because he is faithful and true, and it's his trustworthiness that fuels the fire and the will to fight that is inside of us, to keep going, because we know that he will give us what he promises. And if we take that and think back to Psalm 37, we wait on the Lord because, and not to sound too modern Christianity, he has a plan. But we know he has a plan, and he has the power to make that plan happen. He speaks things before they come to pass, and then they do just like he said he would. We wait on God because he's coming back. But mostly we wait on God because he is the author and the finisher of our faith, and nothing is over until he comes back and sets everything right. Now go to Hebrews chapter 12. We actually saw this verse last week. Let me set my timer so I don't go too long and end up losing our video again. We saw this verse last week when I used it to show how we are to endure our spiritual battles because of the peace that God has set before us. And as Paul admonished us, when we begin to falter in our own struggles, we have yet to resist to the point of bloodshed like Christ did, right? So Hebrews 12, verse 1, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, and he's referring to all the people noted in chapter 11, what's considered the faith chapter, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Right now, I've got a series of questions that I want to ask before we talk about the metaphor of the shield of faith. I'm just going to get them out, and then we're going to deal with them one at a time. We're going to ask the question, what is faith? What is hope? How are they interconnected? And what does Paul mean when he says that Christ is the author and the finisher of our faith? So before I get into, my perspective, what is faith?
Faith is believing God and what he says he has predicted he will do, trusting him. And the way I get a lot of faith myself is after studying the Old Testament and all the promises and everything that were fulfilled back then. And I said, well, that proves that what he did in the past is just a little taste of what he's going to do in the future. And
so does faith point to the future or the past?
I think you look at what he has already done and you believe that he actually was behind all that and he brought it to fulfillment, and then you know that all the promises for the future, they're going to come true too. He doesn't change. He doesn't lie. You can trust him.
Right. So does faith point forward or backwards?
I think it's both. If you didn't have the Old Testament, and if you didn't know he fulfilled all those promises, how would you know he was going to fulfill them in the future? All the promises that point to Jesus as being the Messiah, all those prophecies that predicted that. How could that happen all by itself?
All right, go to Hebrews 11.
Yeah.
Because we need to talk about how faith and hope are interrelated, and they are they're not indistinguishable, but they're inseparable. It's just one verse, Hebrews 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So we stand and we experience life in present time. So faith, let me just say this and I'll put these things together. Faith looks backwards and looks at God's historical record of being faithful and true each and every single time. Each and every single time. We take that faith, having been convinced of who he is, that he will say what he says he will do, or he will do what he says he will do. And we project that faith into the future in form of hope. So hope is future expectation, positive future expectation. But the predication of our hope and our future expectation of positive outcomes is based on what we've been convinced of God in the past, and that's our faith. So we look at the past record, God's legacy and character and his consistency, his faithfulness, and that colors how we see the future. That's how faith and hope are connected together. And that's why Paul says faith is the substance of things hoped for. If you are unconvinced of God, how can you hope in a future that he says will happen? You can't. You must be convinced that he is who he says he is and will do what he says he will do. That's why faith is the substance of things hoped for, and it's the evidence of things not seen, things that have not happened yet that he has promised, because every promise he's made in the past has been fulfilled, which means every promise in the future will be fulfilled as well. That's how they're connected. And honestly, I struggled with that for years, not understanding how those pieces fit together, right? And until I realized that in this present moment that we experience, right, that the faith we have in God is based on the record of his past. Everything, every promise fulfilled, all the prophecies that have come to pass, and the absolutely consistent nature of God's character and his motive. So that confidence in his record, his track record, is what allows me to meet the future. Even though the future might be uncertain in many aspects, it allows me to meet the future with positive expectation, to live with a spirit of hope and not a spirit of fear. And I don't mean an angel on one shoulder and a demon on the other, one being positive, the other one being negative. I'm not talking about that kind of spirit, but I'm using, which Paul does, uses the word spirit in terms of an intangible force or something that you can't see, you can't touch it, but it has an impact. Can fear and hope have an impact on you? Yes or no?
Yes.
I think I heard a yes. Was that you, Jeannie? Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I actually said it twice.
It was so quiet. I'm like, I think somebody said something.
Oh, sorry. I was on mute, so you're on background stuff.
Yeah, you're also a little far away from the microphone, so you sound a little distant. So this word, let's just look at the words for a second. The word faith, which is pistis in Greek, can be used as a noun, can be used as an adjective, and of course there is there's a verb form of that as well. But it, we can look at that and use words that were just kind of help us understand, I guess, the depth and the breadth of that word, right? Trust or being trustworthy, confidence or reliability, certainty, dependability, assurance, or I couldn't find a real good adjective that correlates to the noun assurance, but I thought of guarantor. I mean, that's really what faith is all about. Having trust, having confidence, certainty, and assurance. Now, the word hope, or elpizo, it's very simply that positive expectation for the future, right? But even hope as a positive expectation can have some element of uncertainty depending on who you place your hope in or what you place your hope in, right? The greatest uncertainty in the future comes when we put hope and trust in ourselves. But if you want to be assured and confident of a positive outcome for the future, where do we place our hope? Right? We place our hope in the one who calls things that will be as they are and then makes it come to pass. Go to Isaiah 42 for a second. And I love some of these passages because it just speaks to this whole idea of the hope of the Christian, not using that phrase specifically to refer to the resurrection, although it's kind of hard to separate that. But Isaiah 42:1 says, "Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth. He will not fail, nor be discouraged till he has established justice on the earth." Can you imagine that world where there's nothing but perfect justice? And the coastlands, which is sometimes a word for the Gentiles, shall wait for his law. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. I am the Lord, that is my name. And my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. That's his power. He makes stuff happen, and he's always trustworthy. Right? So in the face of such power and glory, why would we put trust and faith in ourselves? Which is why Proverbs 3 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Flip forward now to Romans chapter 5. Just read a few verses here. Romans 5:1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. So there's a payoff on the other side of the battle, right? Now, hope does not disappoint. Probably a bad word to translate, probably better disgrace. Now, hope does not disgrace us, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given, or which was given to us. Paul gives us another progression. Paul and Peter, they love to connect all these pieces together for us, right? Faith in God through Christ turns the Father's wrath from us, and we live in peace with him, and we stand in the place of grace, having been declared innocent or having been justified. But Paul also says that we rejoice when things get tough, because, as we know, and we'll see here in a second, when we're weak, he is strong. And he says that hope does not disgrace us, meaning that every battle we fight and win proves that our faith is not misplaced, that we can trust him at the next battle, moving forward with that hope for a positive future. And that's, again, why Paul says that hope does not disgrace us, meaning that our faith in God projected into the future in the form of a positive expectation of hope and grace and peace is never, ever misplaced. Ever. Even when we have weaknesses that our enemy continues to exploit, even if that weakness is something that God has chosen to not remove from us or to not help us completely overcome. If you look on the screen there, if you haven't already, from faith flows peace with God, hope, grace, strength, and endurance. And if you don't know the historical record of who God is, how can you hope for the future? Which is why it's such a travesty that so many Christians and churches don't even bother with the Old Testament. That is the basis of our faith. Now, sometimes God has to do things to keep us honest, right? If we had nothing but victory, 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 pretty soon it's kind of easy to start to rely on ourselves. And sometimes he doesn't remove our weakness. He wants us to fight through it. Go to 2 Corinthians 12. Because Paul addresses this idea that sometimes God doesn't remove things like weaknesses because he wants us to fight, but in fighting he wants us to realize how weak we are so we can rely on him. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. Paul has just described how 14 years prior he had been taken up to paradise to see and hear things that he was not allowed to reveal. But then he describes how God gave him a weakness that he didn't have before. And it was a weakness that Satan was allowed to routinely exploit, which kept Paul humble when, honestly, he had every human reason to be prideful and boastful. So 2 Corinthians 12:7, and lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, meaning the things that he had been shown, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. And that word literally means to pummel with your fist. Lest I be exalted above measure. God allowed it so Paul wouldn't get prideful. And he said to me, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, quote, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress. I take pleasure in the battle for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, how all of this fits together, this relationship is much like our discussion on righteousness and how I try to probably awkwardly communicate that the righteousness of Christ is constantly filling in the gap between our own righteousness and the impossible high standard of perfect righteousness. We can't ever attain that. So Christ steps in and he fills in the gap for us. God's strength fills in the gap between our own limited strength and endurance and the perfect strength and endurance that he would like to see in his people. I'm strong not because I am strong, but because in recognizing my weakness, I allow God to complete me with his strength. And understanding that keeps me humble because I can't do anything of significance without him. And imagine a soldier in a battle who knows for a fact that whenever his own strength begins to fail and he weakens, that he has an unlimited source of strength and endurance that he can draw on to continue the fight. And that's the message that we're hearing. God is always there, and his strength, his endurance, his patience, his righteousness is always there for us, but we can only access it by humbling ourselves and admitting our weaknesses. That's when God steps in and fills in the gap. And this idea of him completing us, this is what Paul means when he says that God is the author and the finisher, or the author and the perfecter, or the author and the completer of not just our faith, but our righteousness, our strength and endurance. Everything begins and everything ends with him. Let's take a look at these words here. Author and the finisher. When the way that Paul wrote this, he basically, the descriptor, the author and the finisher of our faith, it reads like a title, kind of like the Melchizedek. If you remember back in Hebrews 7, when it talks about Melchizedek, we've shown you in the past how Melchizedek is not a proper name. It's a title. It's the King of Peace. That's what it is, a title, not a name. So Paul groups author and finisher together, reinforcing that the creation and the completion of faith are inseparable, and they're tied up in this one man who's given the title of the author and the finisher. Now, in context, Hebrews 12 verse 2 is talking about the cross, right? Paul is talking about Hebrew believers or talking to Hebrew believers when he talks about our faith, the author and the finisher of our faith. He's referring to the fact that the ancient Jews, especially all the faith heroes of chapter 11, all waited for the promise and the coming of the Messiah. And when Christ died on the cross and rose from the grave, he became the fulfillment of all their hopes and their expectations. He spoke the very prophecies that pointed to himself. And when he rose from the grave, he completed or fulfilled their hope. He finished it. And that's the primary way to understand the verse. But as with many things that Paul writes and other people in the Bible that have an immediate and obvious interpretation, sometimes there's something else going on there if you just kind of scratch under the surface a little bit. Oftentimes there's a general principle that can be applied to us, even though we're not first century Jews, like the people that Paul was talking to. And that principle is that for you and I here in the year 2020, our faith begins and ends with Christ too. We're no different than they were in that respect. Right? We have promises that are set before us that have yet to be fulfilled. The promise of his return, the promise of his kingdom of peace, eternal life, everything about the inheritance. It's all still future. But we trust and we have faith that we'll get there because he said so. All we have to do is stick to the battle, stay on our feet. Now, if you go back to Ephesians chapter 6, these promises and their certain fulfillment form the literal shield of Paul's metaphorical armor of God. Let me show you a couple of things about this armor. Let me read Ephesians 6:16 again. Above all, taking the shield of faith with which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. The Roman legion of Paul's time used these tall, oblong or rectangular shields that were about 2.5 feet wide and about 4 feet tall. They were often called a scutum, which in Italian I believe means door. And it was usually made of a wooden frame that had a canvas cover. Then it was covered with animal hides. So there were multiple layers. It was about the thickness of a hand, the breadth of a hand, and the outer edge was covered in iron, and it had this thing in the middle. I don't know if you can see it. The image might not be too large enough, but right in the middle it had what was called a metal boss. It was just a protuberance that they could use if a rock was thrown at them. They could use it. They could bump someone with it and maybe cause some damage. It was a pretty serious shield. But it weighed between 35 to 60 pounds or so, and according to experts, it balanced speed with strength. When it was held out in front, the Roman long shield covered almost the entire soldier. It was big enough to protect their body, but it was small and maneuverable enough that their sword arm was free, and they used the Roman short sword, which was free then to poke or to stab. And in close quarter combat, all they had to do was hold the shield up, and the enemy would exhaust themselves hacking away at the shield, and they wouldn't be able to get through it. And when the enemy got tired and couldn't defend themselves, they just poke them with a sword, and the battle was over. And this was one of several different tactics and strategies that the Roman army used to conquer their enemies, and they did it fairly quickly. Now, in the text, in Ephesians 6:16, Paul said, above all, take the shield of faith. What does Paul mean when he says above all?
As the most important.
Yeah, it's probably how most of us would interpret it, right?
Another thing too, what I liked in that verse too, it says, with which you will be able to quench some of the fiery darts of the wicked one. Is that what it says? All of the fiery darts.
It says you will be able to.
Will be able to.
Yeah, that's a certainty, right?
Right.
So that again, going back to the word or the phrase above all take the shield, that can be taken two ways. One is correct. The wrong way is what Walter said, and I'm not saying that because I'm saying Walter's wrong, because that's what I have always believed, but it's not about importance. The English Standard Version, the ESV, and several other more modern translations might translate it as in all circumstance, but there's no reason to translate it that way. Above all, it's another prepositional phrase, the preposition epi, which means over or on or upon. And it literally means over in a physical sense. And so Paul is saying, take your metaphorical shield of faith and lift it over your head. Lift it over your head. Which is exactly the other thing that the Roman long shield was designed to do. The Roman military developed many military tactics that allowed them to conquer their enemies and dominate in war. One is called the Roman turtle, or the testudo formation. You may have seen this in movies. Basically, a group of soldiers would gather together shoulder to shoulder, and they would raise the shields overhead to create this turtle shell effect, and it protected not just the individuals, but the whole group from arrows and projectiles that were thrown from great distances. Or if, as you can see over here, if they were trying to breach or storm a wall or an entrance, normally what would happen is people that were up on the parapet on the top of the wall would throw down rocks and stones and spears, and this formation, this holding the shield overhead, would protect them. This was an exceptional strategy that allowed them to conquer their enemies with minimal loss. So what does that mean to you and me? You know, where we are in the whole armor of God is that we've already been told to strap on the belt of truth, right? And again, in ancient languages, lists, number one, belt of truth is the most important thing. Then we're told to put on the breastplate of righteousness, and then to shod our feet with the hope of the gospel of peace. And after having put on those three pieces of armor, Paul then says, take your shield of faith and stick it over everything else, so that you will be able to quench all the fiery spears and arrows. That's what that word dart actually means. It means anything that's pointed like a projectile, something that can be thrown or hurled that's sharp, that can penetrate. You know what would end up happening? Well, let me say this first, and then I'll make that comment. It's your faith and your trust in God that will protect your truth from the lie and the deceit the enemy will tell you. Because if you don't trust God, there's no point in resisting the deceit and the deception. Your faith and your trust in God will protect your righteousness from the doubt that can seep in and the discouragement that can poison your heart. You know, Paul is no dummy. He uses the word fiery here for a reason. And the word is literally pyro, from which we get like pyrotechnics, pyromania. It was common in ancient warfare for soldiers to take arrows and spears and dip them in, oil or pitch, and then set them on fire. And they would throw a lance or a spear, a javelin, shoot an arrow, knowing that it was going to stick in their enemy's shield and then catch it on fire, and they would have to discard their shield. Now they were defenseless. But the way the Roman long shield was constructed is that it was so thick and it was covered with multiple layers of hide and canvas that it could take a few hits with fiery arrows, but it would give the soldier the opportunity to douse the flames so that they couldn't get ignited. They wouldn't catch fire so easily. And just think a minute. Now, this is all about the wiles of the devil. And think about all the things that we've talked about already. Doubt, deceit, discouragement. These are like fiery arrows and javelins and spears that the enemy is tossing at us, just hoping something is going to stick and catch us on fire. The accuser flings things. And remember that word, the accuser, or oh, I can't remember the Greek word, forgive me. But basically, the root word of the accuser is bellow, it's to throw something. So the enemy is going to throw deceit at you. He's going to throw doubt at you. He's going to throw discouragement at you to see what sticks and sets you on fire, what inflames you. And whether it's deceit or doubt or discouragement, it can lead us down several wrong paths. They can incite us to anger, to bitterness, to thirst for vengeance. Or it can bring in that spirit of fear, causing us to abandon the power and the love and the wisdom of God. And so the question then becomes, how do we extinguish the fire inside us that would have us strike back, trading like for like, or maybe simply just give up and join the enemy and abandon our commander? Well, if you have no faith, if you have no understanding of the track record of God, the promises he has spoken, and the absolute certainty that he will continue to fulfill every promise that he has made, it's easy to join your enemy. It's easy to give up. It's easy to buy into the lie, to give in to doubt, and to have that discouraged heart and start seeking answers somewhere else. So it's our faith in God, knowing that in our weakness he is our strength. That in our own unrighteousness, he is our righteousness. He is our perfecter. And he's more than able to not just start things, but to finish them. Everything he started, everything he has promised to bring to bear, he will finish and complete. He is the author and he is the finisher of our faith. I'm looking at my time here. Walter, go ahead.
I was thinking, we read these scriptures about all these, our weaponry, if you will, and our protection. When you look at the Romans here, and Spartans were very similar to this too. Think about that as an assembly of Christians. Whereas one person with one shield and all of, if we come together as a group in this formation, we're protecting each other. And I think we can link this, now I know I'm saying exegetically, it's talking individually, but as a group, we could take this to also show that while each of us does this individually, coming to group as a group, as an assembly, encouraging one another, strengthening one another, while the other person may be a little bit weak, maybe a little tired, holding up that shield. We can be like this formidable army.
Strength in numbers, right?
Strength in numbers.
Particularly when you're well trained and you use the armor and the protection that he's given us.